Friends, today let's talk about a country that can be considered the greatest economic disaster in modern human history, Venezuela. As the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world, it started out with what you could call a royal flush. Yet in less than 10 years, its GDP has dropped by 80%. According to United Nations estimates, by 2024, 82% of the population lives below the poverty line. In the capital, Caracas, there are hillside slums with the highest murder rate in the world. In this country where gasoline is almost free, even basic necessities like toilet paper, food, and medicine are in extreme shortage. Supermarkets have to limit the number of shoppers, and whether you can shop depends on the last digit of your ID number. There is also extremely strict armed security. For over a decade, the country has been trapped in the furnace of hyperinflation, where money is counted by the kilogram. Just how outrageous is the speed of this currency's devaluation? If you were to stack up 100 Bolivar bills from 20 years ago one by one, physically filling up the entire Bird's Nest Stadium, not just one, but 40 Bird's Nest stadiums full of cash, how much would all that be worth? It would barely be enough to buy a hamburger at McDonald's, and you would not even get fries or a soda with it. Hyperinflation, economic sanctions, corruption, institutional failure, price controls, the Dutch disease, political turmoil, all these devilish concepts have somehow come together in this one country. So do not think we are talking about Venezuela today, just because it is a political hotspot. Let's take a look together at how they managed to play such a strong hand so poorly. Venezuela is a country on the northern coast of South America, with a land area of approximately 910,000 square kilometers, slightly larger than the three northeastern provinces of China combined. It currently has a population of about 28 million. Originally, the population was mainly composed of indigenous Indians. From the 16th century onwards, it was ruled by the Spanish for nearly 300 years, hence the continued use of Spanish. It gained independence in 1830, becoming one of the first South American countries to break free from Spanish rule. However, the key factor truly influencing its development was not independence or colonization, but something else entirely. In 1914, Venezuela discovered its first commercial oil well, and in the following 21 years, an obscure country, transformed into the world's second largest oil producer, second only to the United States. We often say oil is black gold, and this windfall made Venezuela's then dictator, Gomez, the richest man in Latin America. In our previous oil episode, we discussed how global oil resources were initially monopolized by 7 British and American oil companies known as the Seven Sisters. Venezuela was allocated to 3 of these: Gulf Oil, Standard Oil, and Pfizer. Initially, these 3 companies held considerable power as oil extraction and transportation technology was relatively scarce. Venezuela, being a small, insignificant country, could only receive a small share of the oil profits. But after World War II, these oil-producing countries began to realize something was wrong. They thought, there are so many companies that can mine oil, but this resource is the rarest and most valuable. We are the landlords. So Vinicius Jr. lobbied the Middle Eastern oil-producing nations and negotiated with the Seven Sisters, signing the famous 50-50 split treaty. Simply put, he said, I'll let you mine, and we'll split the profits 50-50. He then joined forces with 4 Middle Eastern countries to establish OPEC. This immediately boosted Venezuela's government revenue by an order of magnitude. They made another fortune, increasing government revenue 6-fold in just 5 years. But the real golden age was yet to come. Before that, the wealth was only small scale. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out, also known as the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. The Arab countries of the Middle East joined forces to impose an oil embargo on the West, plunging the world into an oil shortage. Oil prices quadrupled in a short period. The price of oil jumped from $3 to $12 a barrel, marking the first oil crisis. A few years later, in 1979, the second oil crisis erupted, with prices soaring to $35 a barrel, 10 times the price a decade earlier. This would have led to global inflation and economic stagnation, but for Venezuela, it was a devastating blow. The biggest beneficiary of these 2 consecutive oil crises was undoubtedly Venezuela. It's an oil-exporting country, has little connection to the Middle East, and is geographically close to the United States. Furthermore, in 1976, the Venezuelan government fully nationalized its oil industry, establishing its own state-owned oil company, PDVSA. If the previous oil prices were a gold mine, this one brought immense wealth. In just 10 years, Venezuela's GDP increased sixfold. The capital, Caracas, saw the construction of South America's most modern highways, skyscrapers, and university towns. State-owned enterprises expanded rapidly, and the number of employees grew to 300,000. Whether it was in elevators, public baths, or at office entrances, you would casually find an attendant standing there. This was considered a job position. After all, the government had plenty of money. Meanwhile, private enterprises continued to shrink, but that didn't matter. Even if big companies weren't profitable, they still received government subsidies to keep them afloat. Venezuela's currency, the Bolivar, became one of the strongest currencies in the world because its exchange rate was extremely stable. At that time, Venezuela's middle class would even fly to Miami for shopping on weekends. As long as oil prices remained high, the Venezuelan government had a continuous stream of resources. As long as oil prices remained high, every citizen could just lie back and enjoy a life of high wages and generous benefits. As long as oil prices remained high, there would be enough machinery to help the entire economy stand at the top of the world. No economic problem seemed to matter at all. But the good times didn't last long. In the 1980s, international oil prices began to plummet. Initially, the Venezuelan government hoped this was just a brief hiccup. So even though government revenues started to decline, they didn't cut back on those redundant government expenditures. Instead, they chose to issue massive amounts of debt, thinking that as soon as oil prices rebounded, they could make a comeback and everything would be fine. But this was clearly too naive. This was only the beginning of a nightmare. To combat high inflation, the United States announced interest rate hikes and capital began to withdraw from Latin American markets. In 1982, Mexico was the first to buckle, announcing it could not repay its foreign debt, officially triggering the Latin American debt crisis. Venezuela was also severely affected. On February 18, 1983, the president announced that the bolivar's exchange rate would be devalued from 4.3 bolivars to the dollar to 7.5 bolivars to the dollar, and began implementing foreign exchange controls. And if you want to, a large portion of its goods relied on imports, which meant that in an instant, the prices of everything you bought nearly doubled. Who could bear that? This day became known as Venezuela's Black Friday. Venezuela quickly plunged into an economic crisis, and in 1986, oil prices collapsed even further, dropping from $27 at the time to less than $10. What they didn't expect was that oil prices would remain at these low levels, fluctuating for nearly 20 years. Inflation in Venezuela began to rise, and although the government tried price controls and foreign exchange controls, none of it worked. Its corruption was so severe that many policies simply couldn't be effectively implemented. In fact, many of these policies were counterproductive, further driving up prices in Venezuela. We'll analyze this in more detail when the situation worsens. The government discovered that various control policies were ineffective, and in 1989, a new president named Perez was elected, going to the other extreme, complete liberalization. Foreign exchange rates, interest rates, and prices were left to the market to fluctuate as it pleased. The government stopped subsidies, and state-owned enterprises were liberalized. This period is also known as the Great Adjustment Period. Those who frequently read our content should be familiar with this extremely liberalized market concept, which was extremely popular in the 1990s, mainly promoted by the United States. At the time, it wasn't just in Latin America, but also in Southeast Asia, and later in Russia and Poland. Shock therapy followed this style, believing that the market could solve all problems on its own. From an economic theory perspective, market-oriented liberalization reforms themselves weren't inherently problematic. The problem was that these policies were too radical. Suddenly abandoning everything had a huge short-term impact on the economy. More importantly, this approach of free market competition has a prerequisite. The market needs a basic business environment and a basic rule of law. In Venezuela at the time, market rules were vague, regulation was almost non-existent. Many laws were practically non-existent, and then the government suddenly stopped providing subsidies for food, energy, and the minimum wage. This inevitably worsened the domestic economy, leading to numerous protests and riots. The bolivar began to plummet. As mentioned earlier, on Black Friday in 1983, the exchange rate was 7.5 bolivars to the dollar. By 1993, it had fallen to 100 bolivars to the dollar. In 1994, a major banking crisis occurred, with more than half of the banks, including the second largest, collapsing. The corruption within the government and financial sector was now completely exposed. President Perez, for embezzling 250 million bolivars from the National Liberty Fund, became the first president to be impeached by the Supreme Court, and the finance minister was forced to resign. This marked the complete failure of the era of major adjustments. Only when the tide receded did everyone realize that almost everyone was swimming naked. This financial crisis is something that many people just gloss over when they talk about it, but in my opinion, its impact on Venezuela's economy was even more direct than the issues we just discussed. It was like a heavy punch, hitting hard and fast. It struck Venezuela in the chin, causing it to collapse on the spot. Speaking of which, I guess you've probably sensed from our conversation that Venezuelan politics is quite chaotic. Just look at how frequently its name has changed. When it gained independence in 1830, it was called the States of Venezuela. Later, it was renamed the Republic of Venezuela. Less than 10 years later, seeing that the American system to the north was quite good, it fought a war and renamed itself the United States of Venezuela. Venezuela was renamed the Republic of Venezuela after World War II, and then it had to be changed again. Although its system has been basically democratically elected, the elections are often invalid or heavily manipulated. There are also many different forces vying for power within the government. So every president is in a precarious position. They have to balance the interests of various interest groups, be constantly worried about being overthrown or impeached, and find ways to attract votes. Of course, they also have to think about how to benefit themselves. This will inevitably lead to many problems. But I think a very fundamental problem in the long run is that its leadership is unable to make long-term investments and formulate long-term plans. To give you a simple example, do you think Venezuelan leaders don't understand that oil prices will continue to fluctuate and won't rise forever? The simplest way to guard against this is to do what Norway does: set up a national fund. When oil revenues are high, save some money, buy some gold, purchase foreign government bonds, and make some long-term investments. Is that really so difficult? Did the Venezuelan government not anticipate this? Actually, it's not like they haven't tried, but these presidents gradually realized that each time they tried to save money, it only became a cash cow for the next few presidents. The dramatic changes in government, coupled with rampant corruption, made any long-term investment almost impossible. And I'm not just talking about investments with returns. It also includes institutional investments, such as investing in anti-corruption efforts and establishing transparent and fair mechanisms. This is very difficult in Venezuela. Therefore, the most effective policy a departing president can implement to support the people is the most direct form of government subsidies. This kind of short-term, quick diplomatic relations can quickly gain public support. From this perspective, look at Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. These are relatively centralized monarchies. Although they have many problems caused by strong power, they can indeed take a longer-term view. Making many long-term investments is not only for the country, but also for one's own future and that of one's descendants. Look at their visionary plans, right? They might even be a bit too willing to invest long-term. In short, Venezuela's politics are quite chaotic. Let's go back to the timeline. From the 1980s to the 1990s, Venezuela's GDP did not grow for 15 years due to low oil prices. The economy was stagnant, and the people increasingly hoped for a major reform. Against this historical backdrop, in 1999, Venezuela's most famous president and most controversial leader came to power, Hugo Chavez. Chavez himself had a military background and led a very strong government. He advocated so-called 21st century socialism and later founded the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. He was very close to Cuba and had a very good relationship with Castro. Several times, when it was Castro's birthday, he would specifically fly over to celebrate with him for several days. In fact, Chavez had attempted to overthrow the existing regime in 1992, though unsuccessfully, but he gained significant public support. Later, in 1997, he ran for election, advocating for large-scale reforms to change the status quo and eliminate corruption. Imagine the public, utterly disillusioned with the corrupt government, certainly hoped for a strong leader to change the situation. Thus, Chavez came to power forcefully and remained president of Venezuela until his death from cancer in 2013. What was Chavez's first action upon taking office? He changed the country's name from the Republic of Venezuela to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He called it a radical reform known as the Bolivarian Revolution. They seem to really like the Bolivarian name, right? The country's name and currency are both Bolivarian. The Bolivarian is actually associated with a great general who helped South America gain independence from Spanish rule in the 19th century, so it carries a symbol of independence and patriotism. Chavez felt that Venezuela, so the previous chaos was mainly due to the encroachment of those evil foreign capitalist forces. They tried to turn the wealth gained from our oil resources into their own profits. Inflation is not a natural economic phenomenon. It's the work of those evil, capitalist, hostile forces. This is their conspiracy. So he carried out a series of sweeping reforms of public ownership. All the key industries, such as banking, infrastructure, transportation, electricity, and communications, were planned and regulated. At the same time, taxes on foreign companies were increased, which scared away most foreign capital. In 2001, the land law was passed, allowing the state to expropriate land and encouraging grassroots people to establish small cooperatives, providing them with funds and technical support as an alternative model to the market economy. Chavez also successfully brought the formerly independent central bank completely under the control of the government through the enactment of several laws. From then on, the government could decide how much money to print. This actually foreshadowed the hyperinflation that followed. But among all the nationalizations Chavez carried out, the most important one I haven't mentioned yet is oil. Hey, are you wondering? Didn't we just talk about this earlier? In 1976, the oil industry had already been nationalized, and a national oil company was established. That's a good question. Actually, although it was theoretically state-owned before, Venezuela was still highly dependent on foreign technology and capital, so Europe and the US still had a lot of influence. So much so that it was even called a state within a state. Chavez felt that it was a disgrace that the lifeblood of our country, the oil company, was still controlled by Americans and Brits, and that so much money had to be given to them. So in 2002, he placed some trusted people onto the board of the National Oil Company, aiming to take full control at once. At the time, he hosted a weekly TV show called Hello, Mr. President. On April 7th, during the show, he had a whistle in his mouth and read out the names of the oil company executives who opposed him one by one. Every time he blew the whistle, he would say, "So-and-so, you're fired. Get out." Later, the situation escalated and even led to a brief military coup that tried to overthrow Chavez, but he managed to suppress it. At the end of 2002, employees of Venezuela's National Oil Company launched a massive strike, and the country's oil production almost came to a halt, dropping from the original 3 million barrels a day to less than 300,000 barrels per day. This was equivalent to the entire engine of the country stalling. Conservative estimates suggest that this strike caused Venezuela an economic loss of $10 billion US, resulting in a 27% drop in GDP in the first quarter of 2003. But these short-term economic losses were still relatively minor. The more fatal blow was the long-term damage it caused. Chavez responded with a very tough approach. Aren't you on strike? Aren't you refusing to work? Fine, you don't need to come back anymore. He fired nearly 20,000 employees all at once. You might not think that's such a huge number now. For Venezuela's national oil company at the time, this meant firing nearly half of its employees. And you have to realize, this was different from a typical layoff. Normally, layoffs target those who are easiest to let go, but this time, they specifically targeted those who took to the streets. It didn't matter if you held critical technical knowledge or occupied a key position. If you protested, you were out. As a result, many core technical experts were also dismissed. After this upheaval, Chavez did indeed manage to take firm control of the national oil company, but the price was extremely steep. Not only did foreign technical staff leave, but he also dismissed more than half of his own strong technical backbone, causing Venezuela's oil technology to regress by more than a decade. Both management standards and technical capabilities never recovered. As equipment aged and expertise was lost, even more than 20 years later, Venezuela's oil production capacity is still less than half of what it was at its pre-strike peak. The oil is just sitting there. They let you dig, but you just can't get anything out. After running a couple of times, he starts panting and can't keep up, so he has to sit and rest for half a day. And many American oil giants, including ExxonMobil, had their assets forcibly seized or were forced to accept new contracts in the period that followed. You see, the vast area of refineries in the Gulf of Mexico was designed specifically for Venezuelan heavy oil. This disruption wasn't just about losing a few barrels of oil in the short term. It meant that for the next few decades, these newly heavily invested refineries would face a famine. They wouldn't have any oil to refine and would have to rely on Canadian heavy oil as a substitute. So, as we analyzed before, the US's surprise attack on Venezuela was definitely partly due to its oil reserves. Not just because they were plentiful, but because they were all... The situation regarding heavy oil at US refineries is starting to get complicated. Let's briefly recap some basic information to understand why oil-rich countries like Venezuela struggle to escape the so-called oil curse. It's not as simple as just having money leading to corruption. You see, possessing abundant natural resources leads to exports and the acquisition of large amounts of US dollars. Then, these dollars are converted into the local currency, the glassvar, causing its continuous appreciation. With currency appreciation, Venezuela's domestic products become more expensive and less competitive compared to other countries. Meanwhile, goods from other countries become cheaper, leading Venezuela to favor purchasing them. This significantly weakens Venezuela's domestic agriculture and manufacturing sectors, causing their gradual decline. So, over time, from a national perspective, its economic model becomes a frantic export of oil to buy other things. Over 95% of its exports are oil, while over 80% of its industrial raw materials and over 60% of its food are imported. Its domestic manufacturing and agriculture have declined, with the service sector becoming the dominant industry. It's like a rich kid who, because God has given them so much, can't help but fall into poverty. This phenomenon has a specific term in economics, the Dutch disease, named after a similar situation that occurred in the Netherlands in the 1960s. However, I think it should be called the Venezuelan disease. Actually, if this so-called disease could continue indefinitely, it wouldn't be a big problem. I could just keep selling oil, making money, and buying other things. The key issue is that the country's industrial capacity has declined. It can't produce anything itself. It's essentially... This economy has lost its immunity. The slightest disturbance can cause it to collapse. This is why the drop in oil prices in the 1980s had such a severe impact on Venezuela's economy. You might normally think that a drop in oil prices would just mean less profit, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to a collapse. Why? Because its non-oil sector had lost its effectiveness and completely degenerated. And the key to all this is the exchange rate. Look at Chavez's actions with the oil companies. Foreign investors naturally avoided the country and withdrew completely. The domestic population also lacked confidence in the country's economy and currency. They would try to exchange their money for US dollars, leading to a continuous decline in the bolivar's exchange rate and a continuous rise in prices. Faced with these two classic economic difficulties, Chavez's response was very simple and brutal. The exchange rate is falling? No way. I'll set an official exchange rate. Prices are rising? No price increases allowed. I'll set a price ceiling for you. This kind of distortion of supply and demand did, to some extent, maintain Venezuela's purchasing power. But the cost was a further decline in domestic productivity, a more distorted economic structure, the growth of corruption in the black market, more capital flight, and even greater shortages of goods. At this point, Venezuela was already critically ill. However, things didn't deteriorate rapidly. Instead, life in Venezuela actually started to improve bit by bit. Why? Do you know why? Because oil prices went back up, and this time they soared even higher. In the early 2000s, the global economy experienced a boom. Demand for oil surged, and oil prices increased sixfold in 7 years. Venezuela's mountain of gold returned. With this influx of abundant US dollars, the entire economy returned to the prosperous scene of the 1970s. Chavez did not use this breathing space to establish a reserve fund. Instead, he spent lavishly on subsidies, providing the public with almost free electricity, almost free water, almost free oil, extremely cheap food, and massive housing subsidies. He also set up thousands of free medical clinics for the poor. At that time, gasoline in Venezuela was even cheaper than bottled water. $100 worth of gasoline was enough to drive around the world several times over. The government was becoming increasingly large and bloated. About a quarter of Venezuela's working population worked in government. Although the economic structure was unbalanced and basic necessities had to be imported, it didn't matter because gasoline prices were rising. People had more money in their pockets, and people's lives improved under Chavez's leadership. The country's GDP quadrupled in just 10 years. Venezuela was gradually eliminating poverty, and its urbanization rate had reached 90%, the highest in South America. At this rate, it could soon become one of the world's richest countries again. To encourage people to take out loans, Chavez set a cap on interest rates. He encouraged people to borrow more, spend more, invest more, and not save money. The highest interest rate for credit cards at the time was 29%. You might think that sounds very high, but you should know that Venezuela's inflation rate at the time was 30% to 50%. That is to say, its loan interest rate was lower than the inflation rate. With inflation and a consistently negative real interest rate, the amount you actually have to repay after borrowing money is decreasing, while saving money results in increasing losses. Naturally, everyone borrows money and doesn't save. This led to a consumer frenzy frenzy in Venezuela. People used their wages to buy cars, home appliances, luxury goods, and travel abroad. Many people bought cars not to drive, but as an investment. They would buy a car without hesitation if they could get a car loan. The real estate bubble was even worse. This negative real interest rate accelerated the entire economy, making capital turnover faster and faster. At that time, a very interesting consumption trend emerged: cosmetic surgery. Venezuela became one of the countries in the Americas most fond of cosmetic surgery. Many women considered cosmetic surgery an essential step in their coming-of-age ceremony. Families with the means would prepare money for their daughters to have cosmetic surgery. Now, there is a social consensus that cosmetic surgery is a necessary path to better career opportunities and higher social status. After all, with such high inflation, it's impossible to save money, but cosmetic surgery is a long-term investment in one's life. You should know that Venezuela is a global powerhouse in beauty pageants, arguably the strongest in the world. Venezuela has won the most championships in the 4 major international beauty contests, earning it the nickname the Land of Beauties. It has a very comprehensive beauty pageant system. Not only is there the prestigious Miss Venezuela competition, but every city, every community, and even every school holds its own beauty contest. This has created a complete and thorough selection mechanism for beauty pageants. Naturally, this has also given rise to a supporting industry chain for pageant training, beauty treatments, and cosmetic surgery. All right, we just took a little detour to talk about something lighter. Now let's get back to the main storyline. In 2013, Chavez died of cancer. During his 14 years in power, oil prices first kept rising and then fluctuated at high levels. He used the wealth brought by oil to directly improve the lives of Venezuelans. However, some underlying economic issues, such as structural problems, corruption, and government inefficiency, continued to worsen under the nourishment of oil dividends. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, who also came from the United Socialist Party, was not so lucky. Almost as soon as he took office, before he even had time to settle in, oil prices started to plummet. Venezuela's good days were over. The crisis of the 1980s basically repeated itself, only this time it hit even harder. The country's own economic structure and inefficient state-owned enterprises simply couldn't meet domestic demand. Most necessities had to be imported, bought from overseas. But now, with oil prices falling, Venezuela had no money and couldn't afford to buy anything. In 5 years, Venezuela's imports dropped to 1/6 of what they used to be, plunging the country into a severe shortage of goods. The shortages were so severe that by 2015, due to the lack of supplies and the government's price controls that prevented prices from rising, many food items, including toilet paper, would be snatched up as soon as they hit the shelves. Many supermarkets had to be surrounded by iron fences, and armed security guards were arranged to patrol the stores to prevent excessive chaos or incidents of shoplifting. If you didn't know better, you'd think there was some kind of treasure inside. Later, as the lines in front of supermarkets became unbearably long and chaotic, the government required people to shop according to a quota system. The last digit of your ID number determined which day you could go to the supermarket. For example, if your ID ended in 0 or 1, you could shop on Monday. If it ended in 2 or 3, then Tuesday, and so on in rotation. To prevent people from using someone else's ID, fingerprint scanners were even installed at supermarket entrances. At the peak of the shortages in 2017, many people survived by scavenging food from garbage. Out of humanitarian concern, Colombia opened its borders to provide Venezuelans with some supplies and food aid. But even with such severe shortages and skyrocketing prices, I wouldn't even say food card 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, there was one thing in Venezuela that always remained very cheap, even the cheapest in the world: gasoline. Note, this is not crude oil, but the gasoline you put in your car. Why is that? Actually, it's not because Venezuela's oil production costs are low. As I just mentioned, their equipment is outdated, and there's a shortage of skilled workers, so they hardly have the capacity to refine gasoline. Most of their gasoline has to be imported. The reason it can be so cheap is because the government keeps pouring huge subsidies into it. It's practically free. You could fill up your tank for just $1, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. When gasoline is almost free, everyone rushes to fill up, and the cost shifts from money to waiting time. You just have to queue. So many people spend their days just waiting in line. Let me tell you, if you ever go to Venezuela, though I wouldn't recommend it, you'll see long lines of cars by the roadside, just sitting there all day, barely moving. It's not a traffic jam, they're all waiting to get gas. In the capital, Caracas, it's actually not too bad. You have to wait an average of 5 to 6 hours. In many other places, people wait for several days, even up to a week. Basically, people spend their days sitting in their cars in line, and when the gas station closes at night, they lock up their cars and go home to sleep, then come back the next day to keep waiting in line. Of course, there are also market-oriented gas stations that charge according to international oil prices, and there are no lines at those. But the vast majority of Venezuelans have already gotten used to this free gasoline, so they still choose to wait in line. Think about it. This isn't just a problem at a single gas station or in a few cities. It's a nationwide phenomenon. What a huge waste of resources. People line up at the supermarket, line up for gas at any given moment. Countless people across the country are waiting in line. And what's even more troublesome is that with such heavy subsidies, smuggling becomes a problem. Many people smuggle this cheap gasoline to neighboring Brazil or Colombia to sell it. It's estimated that the value of this smuggled gasoline exceeds $10 billion a year, so gasoline is already in such short supply, and yet a huge amount is being smuggled abroad. Hearing all this, you might wonder, back when oil prices were high and the government was flush with cash, it made sense for them to subsidize. But now, with the economy in such bad shape and the government running a huge deficit, why are they still subsidizing? Why not just stop the subsidies? It's not that the Maduro government doesn't want to stop the subsidies. They simply don't dare. People have already gotten used to gasoline that's practically free. If they suddenly let prices go, the cost of gas could skyrocket by hundreds or even thousands of times, which would trigger intense public dissatisfaction, anger, and protests. The Maduro regime is already unstable as it is, so they have no choice but to grit their teeth and keep subsidizing. What's even more troublesome now is that there's an added blow: US sanctions. In fact, starting in 2006, the United States imposed some small-scale sanctions on Venezuelan individuals, including Chavez himself. From 2014 onwards, the US stated that the Venezuelan government had committed human rights violations, undermined democracy, and manipulated elections, among other issues, and therefore imposed increased sanctions. Gradually, the sanctions evolved from targeting individuals to sanctioning the entire country. Especially after Trump took office in his first term, he refused to recognize Maduro as president or his regime. The US, along with dozens of other countries, imposed very strong and comprehensive economic sanctions on Venezuela. The most significant impacts were on the oil industry and financing transactions, freezing the assets of the national oil company, prohibiting the US from buying its oil, and restricting all financing activities of the Venezuelan government and oil companies. This meant that sanctions on the oil industry prevented the Venezuelan government from earning money, and restrictions on financing prevented it from borrowing money. Venezuela itself faced both US sanctions and a severe decline in its extraction capacity following the major strikes. As a result, Venezuelan oil production plummeted by 90% after 2015, leading to increasing government debt and a growing deficit. The deficit kept getting bigger and bigger. In 2017, the government selectively defaulted on its foreign debt, and Maduro had no choice but to activate his backup plan, which is also the last thing economists want to see. He started up the printing presses. We talked before about how Zimbabwe had to keep introducing new currencies because its currency was depreciating so quickly. The zeros were being added at such a fast rate. Venezuela was pretty much the same. Its previous currency was called the Bolivar, but because of severe devaluation, in 2008, they knocked off some zeros and introduced a new currency called the strong Bolivar. That is, one strong Bolivar equaled 1,000 old Bolivars. At first, $1 was worth 2.15 strong Bolivars. Later, as it kept depreciating, $1 was worth 10 strong Bolivars. You might think that this rate of devaluation still seems manageable, but let me tell you, that's just the official exchange rate. On the black market, the rate had already reached $1 to 10,000 strong Bolivars. Because the black market was so rampant, the official rate had to follow suit. And by August 2018, it had plummeted to $1 to 4 million strong Bolivars. So what did they do? They knocked off 5 more zeros and introduced a new currency unit called the sovereign Bolivar. One sovereign Bolivar equaled 100,000 strong Bolivars. By 2019, inflation in Venezuela had already exceeded 300,000%. That means that 30,000 bolivars today would be worth just 1 bolivar next year. So in 2020, they introduced yet another new currency called the digital bolivar, knocking 6 more zeros off the sovereign bolivar. Doesn't it sound like a tongue twister at this point? The current exchange rate is about $1 to 325 digital bolivars. If you were to use the original version of the bolivar from the year 2000, you'd have to add 14 zeros after that 325. That is 3.25 followed by 14 zeros. Honestly, you don't need any economics knowledge to imagine that when prices rise to this extent, the economy is basically completely paralyzed. Everyone's holding money feels like it's burning their hands. They just want to spend it as soon as possible. You don't care which is expensive or cheap. If you see toilet paper, buy it and hoard it. Forget about investing or producing anything. Historically, once a country falls into this vortex of hyperinflation, it's very difficult to escape. But look at Venezuela. Its hyperinflation miraculously dropped in 2020. You ask why? I'll tell you. It's not miraculous at all. Venezuelans completely abandoned their own currency. No strong bolivar, no sovereign bolivar. Even if you gave me a super powerful bolivar, I wouldn't believe it. The whole country started using the US dollar for transactions on a large scale, becoming dollarized. Now, when you walk into a restaurant, a roadside stall, or a supermarket, most prices are in US dollars. The Venezuelan dollar barely circulates, and you have to understand that the US dollar isn't the official currency in Venezuela, so banknotes are extremely rare. You can't withdraw any from ATMs, especially small change. This leads to a rather amusing situation. For example, if you go to a restaurant and spend $13, don't expect the restaurant to give you the $2 in change. You just order a few more things to make it $15, and everyone's happy. Therefore, American dollar payment apps like Zelle and PayPal are very common in Venezuela. This means that a large number of transactions in Venezuela are actually completed between US banks. You can imagine how helpless the Venezuelan banks and government are. In the past 10 years, more than 8 million people have fled Venezuela. That's over a quarter of its population, all leaving within just a few years. Among them are many talented people, the wealthy students. Anyone who could run did. Actually, those problems of corruption and economic structure weren't entirely unsolvable, but now that so many people have left, this is a completely irreversible loss. The long-term blow to Venezuela can be described as devastating. Many people earn less than $10 a month, less than $10 a month. There's simply no way to meet basic needs. Most of them rely on money sent by relatives who have gone abroad to make ends meet. Many of these relatives are elders. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, many people immigrated to Venezuela full of hope. Who could have imagined that after so many years and so many ups and downs, now their children are being forced to flee the country? Just think about it. This wave of migration has also led in recent years to South American countries like Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Argentina, and others taking in hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan immigrants. In the short term, this has indeed taken away many local jobs, causing great instability throughout South America. So this migration wave can be considered one of the major crises facing South America today. By 2020, the country's GDP had fallen to just 15% of what it was 10 years earlier, even lower than the level in 1980. But after listening to our earlier analysis, I think you can see that the high GDP from over a decade ago didn't mean the economy was thriving back then. And the recent economic collapse isn't just a problem of the past decade or so, nor is it solely the fault of the Maduro or Chavez governments. Rather, it's the result of a century's worth of deep-rooted problems accumulating and erupting all at once. Actually, if you look at the urban development in Venezuela, it's not like in many African countries where poverty is immediately obvious. You can tell that Venezuela used to be wealthy. But in the past decade, the government has truly run out of money, and the management of many public services and welfare has basically been in a half-abandoned, laissez-faire state. Overall, public security is extremely poor. That's why, starting a few years ago, many countries' official advisories have warned their citizens not to travel to Venezuela, saying it's very dangerous. In the Venezuelan capital, there's an area called Petare. The walls there are painted in all sorts of bright colors and look quite beautiful, but in reality, it's one of the largest slums in Latin America, home to over 2 million people. The houses are packed densely together on several hillsides, one right next to another. Many of these homes don't even have stable water, electricity, or sewage systems. During the day, the area seems calm, but that's only because people are either sleeping or have gone into the city to work. But as soon as night falls, it turns into a paradise for gangs and is also one of the regions with the highest crime and murder rates in the world. From what I've seen, even the boldest independent bloggers have to find several experienced guides, travel in groups, and stay inside their cars just to dare to visit this place. And even if you leave this slum in the capital city of Caracas, security in the capital, Caracas, still isn't very good. If you're not careful and wander around places you shouldn't be, your money will be gone in no time. If you drive in the capital, you'll notice that at night, traffic lights are basically just decorations. No one pays attention to them at all. Everyone just runs the red lights. Why is that? It's not that everyone in Venezuela is a criminal or wants to break the law. The main reason is that public security there is really poor. In the past couple of years, there have been incidents where people waiting at red lights were robbed or even shot. So now no one dares to stop. Even when they see a red light, they just step on the gas and speed through. As for the traffic police, they've simply stopped caring altogether. The whole city, the whole country, has basically fallen into a state of complete traffic anarchy. Take the subway, for example. At first glance, it looks way better built than New York's subway system. That's because it was constructed in the early 2000s, back when the country was especially wealthy. But now, the government neither has the ability nor the resources to operate the subway. The entire Caracas subway system is free. All the ticket machines and turnstiles are just for show, and even the escalators have stopped running. The subway itself is still operating, but not very frequently. Since it's free anyway, everyone just relies on their own ability. If you can squeeze in, you get a seat. Also, there's no AC. Venezuela relies on 50-year-old hydroelectric plants for national power, but poor maintenance and staff shortages cause blackouts almost every other day. Especially in 2019, there was a massive nationwide blackout that lasted for over a week, resulting in at least 43 deaths. Later investigations revealed that out of the $100 billion invested by Congress in the power system, over $80 billion was misappropriated, and more than 14 thermal power plants were completely inoperable. You can imagine the level of corruption here. After making so many videos analyzing national economies, I've realized that you can't just look at research reports and economic data. If we only focus on economic analyses, we might develop some misconceptions about the lives of people in these countries. Actually, you can watch videos and vlogs made by people living there. So I watched a lot of them just to see how people there talk about their own lives. I actually have a deep impression that, judging from their happiness index and the emotions they show, their lives might not be as miserable or unfortunate as people imagine just by looking at economic data. These economic problems are real. Venezuela's economy is a mess, but South Americans are optimistic, open-minded, and know how to enjoy life. Despite low wages or government issues, they still complain, but they easily burst into laughter, dance to music, and watch baseball on weekends. The capital, Caracas, is indeed chaotic and has a high crime rate, but that doesn't mean everyone is so nervous that they don't dare go out. People still go about their business as usual, going to work, going to school. If you see a gang doing a deal over there, just take a detour around them. If you see a red light, just don't stop. In recent years, with the comprehensive dollarization of Venezuela, the problem of inflation has basically disappeared. The government's finances have become extremely tight, forcing them to abandon the all-encompassing welfare policies of the past. Surreal economic phenomena like lining up for gas and number restrictions at supermarkets have gradually disappeared. Although goods have once again filled supermarket shelves, market-driven prices have made products in Venezuela even more expensive than those in Miami across the sea, and people's real wages are still below the level of 50 years ago. Gangs demand protection fees, and the police often collect tolls as well. The whole country has fallen into a law of the jungle situation, with a somewhat semi-anarchic atmosphere. After capturing Maduro, what the United States values more is likely Venezuela's oil and political influence, and it is unlikely to put much effort into transforming its economic structure or social order. Overall, the uncertainty of its economic development is extremely high, and it has basically entered a stage of shock therapy. A resource-rich economy with ample income may fail to use its oil well, fueling corruption, eroding productivity, and worsening imbalances. Meanwhile, policies like price, exchange, and interest rate controls were counterproductive, triggering hyperinflation. This is just like a child whose mind is not yet fully mature. He will also make mistakes and feel lost. Under normal circumstances, harsh reality would immediately teach him a lesson. This serves as an automatic error-correcting mechanism. But if he suddenly comes into an astronomical amount of wealth, this error-correcting mechanism is very likely to fail. Minor economic imbalances, small-scale corruption, and slight price distortions, if they don't receive timely feedback in an environment of continuous wealth inflow, will only become more pronounced, leading further and further away from the right path. By the time the situation has become critical, if oil prices suddenly plummet and the backlash hits, it will enter a vicious cycle, making it very difficult to recover. So sometimes, having too much money and spending it in the wrong places can be even more fatal than having no money at all. Just as Venezuela's former Minister of Energy, also known as the father of OPEC, once said, "Oil will bring us destruction. It is the devil's excrement." Perhaps for Venezuela, oil truly is a curse.